Yes, I've had the opportunity of taking care of a lot of cancer patients, not only in my clinical career in the hospital system previous to going to the mission field, but then in Uchee Pines taking care of patients in the lifestyle center and helping reverse diseases. And in fact, I was up in Wisconsin this last summer. I was speaking for the Wisconsin camp meeting, and I think there were about five former patients that I ran into while I was at camp meeting. A couple of them had different cancer diagnoses in the past. One of them, a particular type of cancer that there's really no conventional treatment for. And she asked if I recognized her, and I said, well, no. And she's like, well, that's good because it was a phone consultation that we had a few times. So I've never seen her face before then. But she's cancer free, and another patient was cancer free, former patient, and others with some other conditions that were doing well health wise now. That's not always the case. I've seen every modality work, and I've seen every modality fail. Um, and you know, we don't come to God and demand what He will do, but we come to Him as the sovereign of the universe, and we say, "Okay, Lord, what would you have me to do?" And then we cooperate with Him as we understand His will is, right? And this evening, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be focusing really on a particular aspect of disease and disease development. And it relates to all different diseases, but of course we're talking about cancer in particular. And that is, we're going to be looking at the mind-body connection. So the connection between the mind and the body, and how that is working out in its manifestation with disease and so on. Here's information that you can find for the ministry. It was posted in there. The main part is just info@npmin.org. That's our email address. And then npmin.org is our website, and that's where you can really connect with us. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about comes out of the book that I wrote, The Law of Life. That's something that you can find on Amazon. Soon we'll have it available on our website as well. And it's also in a Kindle version as well on Amazon. Anyway, so that's just some of the information that we have here. I am going to switch along because my computer actually died just before this presentation, and so I'm using a slightly older version of the presentation, and so I need to flip along in different places, but we'll get through what we need to get through. Now, when we understand, what we need to understand is how things function, really. And all things that function are governed by law, and all laws that govern function are unchangeable. And proper function is only maintained when we remain within the law that governs the particular function. And dysfunction is the result of going outside of the law. And when we consider law, we need to understand that there is a fundamental law of all nature. And this fundamental law is adhered to by everything in creation, whether it is animate or inanimate, and everything that has been created. We understand that two aspects. One, nothing exists from itself. That means that all things are dependent upon material resources, power, and so on outside of itself in order to exist, function, or live. And secondly, that nothing exists for itself. And that means that everything takes in those resources in order to pass it along and do something or give something to others by which others exist and function and live. For example, as humans, you and I, we are dependent upon oxygen, water, food, and so on. But you do not keep all of the oxygen you breathe, all of the water you drink, all of the food that you eat. You take some in, you use it, and you pass along, and other things live off of what you pass along. And everything in creation functions as a channel. Everything in creation takes from its appointed source and then gives to other things. Other things take from that and give on, and so on and so forth. And all of creation operates in a circuit, beginning with God, coming through the channels that he has created in creation, and through Christ back to God. And we see that in the Desire of Ages, the first chapter. And from this fundamental law of taking to give comes things like thermodynamics, which tells us that all energy necessary for a system to function must come from outside that system. In other words, no created system can generate that power that it needs in order to continue its function. It must get power from outside in order to function and continue its function. And from this fundamental law comes cause and effect, where we recognize that every effect has a cause, and every cause produces an effect. The effect does not produce itself because the power, materials, resources needed for it came from outside, and where it came from is the cause, right? And this taking to give is the law of life, which is the foundation of the book and the concept that we would be looking at. Now, to understand how law relates to function and disease, we're going to use the analogy of a road. And so here we have a road, and if you're on the road, you have health, right? And on the road, there's going to be proper function, and it's going to be comfortable. It's going to feel well, right? And there are certain things that you need in order to remain on that road. You need oxygen, you need water, you need food, you need warmth, and so on. I'm not going to list all of the needs, but we just have a representative sample here. Now, what happens when you get off the road? Well, off of the road, there is dysfunction and there is discomfort. And there is something that defines whether you are on the road and whether you are off the road. And that thing that defines whether you're on the road or off the road is law. So for everything that we need, there is a law that governs that need. And if you are within the confines of that law, then it's going to promote health, proper function, and comfort. And if you're outside of that law, then it will result in dysfunction, discomfort, disease, and so on. Now, for an example of what we experience, let's just use warmth, because that's an easy one for us to relate to. If your temperature goes up above the confines of the law that governs your body temperature, now, are you going to feel comfortable or you're going to feel discomfort? You're going to feel discomfort, right? You're going to feel hot, which is uncomfortable. You're going to have symptoms, right? And the symptoms are there to let you know that something is wrong so that you can do something about it. So when you feel hot, maybe you take off layers of clothing, maybe you fan yourself, drink something cold, get out of a hot environment into a cooler environment, something so that your temperature can get back within the confines of the law. And when it's back within the confines of the law, you have comfort and you don't have need of continuing with those remedies in order to get you back into the normal function. Now, if temperature goes in the opposite direction and it gets, your temperature goes down below the level of the law, then you're going to have symptoms as well. This time, instead of feeling hot, you're going to feel cold. And when you feel cold, you do different things in order to get back into the normal range. This time you cover up, you shiver, you get close to something that's warm, you get out of a cold environment and so on, so that your temperature can increase and you can get back within the confines of the law and you can have comfort. Now, when you deviate outside of the law and you start having symptoms, the symptoms are like the rumble strips on the edge of a road. Now, I know that many of you, well, I don't know, there's some international individuals here, you may not have rumble strips. What those are is there are grooves at least in the United States and European, some European countries that I've been to, there are grooves that are put in the road along the side of the road so that if you start going off, it starts causing your car to go while you're going over it to alert you that you're getting off the road. So symptoms are that alerting system to let you know that things are going wrong. It's almost like an alarm going off. If you had a fire alarm going off, well, the fire alarm is not the problem. The fire alarm is actually a part of the solution. The problem is the fire or the smoke, right? And the solution would not be to put a pillow over the fire alarm and tape it down so that you're not bothered by it. The solution would be to take care of the fire. Similarly, with the rumble strips, if you have symptoms and you're going, the correct thing is to redirect to get back on the road and not try to get rid of the rumble strips. Now, with this analogy of the road, if you continue going past just symptoms, your temperature keeps going up and it gets hotter. And instead of having a temperature that's 101, you have a temperature that's 103, 104, 105. Well, you start having something beyond symptoms, you start developing disease, right? So you might have heat stroke, heat exhaustion, something of that nature. And now, instead of just feeling somewhat bad, you feel really bad and you're becoming more and more dysfunctional. You're dehydrated, you can't control your temperature well, you can't think well, you feel very horrible, systems are starting to break down, and so on. And you really have to do something about it right away, and quite significantly, in order to get back within the confines of the law that governs your body temperature. Because if you don't, well, bad things are going to get worse, and you don't want that to happen. So once you start getting farther and farther from the law, there's more and more dysfunction, there's more and more discomfort, and that is on purpose in order to motivate us to do something about it, or to accept help or to ask for help so that we can get back into the confines of the law. Now, the same thing can happen in the opposite direction. As the temperature goes down and farther, you can develop chilblains, frostbite, other things of that nature, shudder, freeze. As you were mentioning with your father and taking pictures in Minnesota in the winter. So you can hit, but it'd be finger freeze, so you can have very real dysfunction and very real damage that happens because the temperature is too low, and you've got to do something about it right away in order to get the temperature back into the confines of the law so that you can function properly, have comfort, and things can go well. And so those all become motivations for you to redirect, reorient, and get back within the confines of the law. Now, most of us could care less about the law, frankly. What we care about is how we feel. And so if we start feeling bad, we want to feel better. And so we will do something in order to feel better. Now, when it comes to chronic pain and chronic pain control or chronic symptom care, what happens, let's just say that pain is your symptom that you're having for a long period of time. One of the ways that we seek to treat that pain is with medication, right? So you take a pain pill. Well, what happens to the road, for those of you that are actually able to see the road, here's the road without the pain pill, here's the road with the pain pill, all right? Without the pain pill and with the pain pill. What's happening? Well, it appears that the road is getting wider. But when you look carefully, did the law change between before medication and after medication? The answer is no. So the law still defines where the road's edge is and when you're on the road or off the road. But when you start taking the pain medication, it makes the road appear to be wider. So now you can drive off the road a certain distance and still think that you're on the road, because in essence, what it does is it moves the rumble strips farther off the road. And if you take stronger medication, it makes the road even wider and you can deviate even farther. And this is actually the danger of chronic symptom care. Chronic symptom care will make it appear that you are not in danger. It will take away your motivation to look for the cause, and you will simply try to go to the medication or the substance in order to take care of the symptoms, which are there rightfully to tell you that something is wrong. Right. So it becomes problematic. Now, what happens if you don't stop at symptoms and disease and you keep going and you keep getting farther and farther from the law? Your temperature gets higher and higher or lower and lower. Well, you're eventually going to get to death. You're going to go from proper function to progressive dysfunction until you cease to function. That's where it's going. And so we want to avoid that, but all of this happens by law. And we must recognize that the symptoms and the disease along the way are not actually part of the problem, they're part of the solution. Because the symptoms and the disease are there to help us to recognize that something is wrong. The something wrong is not the symptoms. The something wrong is not the disease. The thing that's wrong is the cause that leads to the symptoms and leads to the disease. And that's the thing that needs to be fixed. Now, it's also true that we need love, not just oxygen, water, food, and warmth, but we need love as well. And is it possible that there is a law that governs the function of love? And as long as we remain within the confines of that law of love, that we'll have proper function, it'll be comfortable, things will work well. But if we get outside of that law of love, then we can have symptoms, disease, and even death. Well, I would propose to you that that actually is the case. So let's just summarize this little section. We understand from this analogy that health is proper function, which is the effect of staying within the law, and disease is dysfunction, which is the effect of going outside of the law. And symptoms and disease are like the fire alarm and the rumble strips. They're actually good. They're there to let you know that there's something wrong. Now, it's not good that you have it, but it's good that you can have it, because if you didn't have it, you would have nothing to tell you that something was wrong and to cause you to divert from the pathway that you're taking in getting outside of the law. Right. Now, there is, again, the law of cause and effect, and the law of cause and effect shows us that every effect must have a cause, that every cause must produce an effect. And we understand that if the effect is present, then that means the cause is also present. It's got to be there too. Because if you take the cause and you remove the cause, then the effect has to go away. It has to cease, because no effect can produce itself. Again, it's dependent upon power, materials, resources, and so on outside of itself in order to exist or to function. That said, you will never find an effect without a cause. Never. You'll never find an effect without a cause. That means that there is no such thing as chance. There is nothing that is truly random. Everything has a cause, and there's a correlation. Randomness is simply our inability to understand the correlation and predict the outcome. And chance is, frankly, a concept that is consistent with evolutionary theory and is not consistent with the Word of God, because the Word of God says in Proverbs 26 and verse 2, the curse causeless shall not come. And we're also told in Christ's Object Lessons, page 84, in the laws of God and nature, effect follows cause with unerring certainty. And in the Appeal to Mothers, it says the will of God establishes the connection between cause and its effects. So it is God himself who develops this cause and effect, right? He's the author of that law, and he's the one that determines what the effect is for every cause. Now, he's not responsible for the cause, but he does take responsibility for the effect, right? So does God take responsibility for the disease? Yes, he does. But he doesn't take responsibility for the cause of the disease. Now, as we understand from the analogy, disease comes when we get outside of the law. So what do we call it when we break the law? Specifically, when we break God's law? Well, it's called sin. And which law is broken? It's God's law. And what's the foundation of God's law? Well, it's love. It's his character. So disease is the result of a love problem. It's the result of sin. Right? We are told that there is a divinely appointed connection between sin and disease. No physician can practice for a month without seeing this illustrated. If he will be observing and honest, he cannot help acknowledging that sin and disease bear to each other the relationship of cause and effect. Right? Now, does this mean that the disease of the individual is always caused by the individual? And the answer is no. It isn't. And we're going to cover that a little bit more specifically in a few more minutes. Now, you and I are made up of cells. We're made up of 50 to 100 trillion cells in our body. We have over 250 different types of cells, and every cell functions like a little factory. It takes in things so that it can have resources, and then it puts them out and produces products. And in fact, your function as a whole, your whole body's function, and is dependent upon the function of the individual cells in your body. And if you were to lose a particular type of cell, then whatever function or functions are specific to that type of cell, you are going to lose that function in your body as a whole. For example, if somebody develops type 1 diabetes, well, they have an autoimmune condition that kills off the beta islet cells in the pancreas, and those beta islet cells are the only cells in the body that produce insulin. And if you kill off those cells, well, guess what your body can't produce anymore? Insulin. And insulin is responsible for helping the cells get sugar from the bloodstream and the fluid around the cells into the cells so that the cells can use the sugar as its fuel and continue to function. And so if you don't have insulin anymore, then the cells can't take the sugar into them. Now the sugar levels outside go up, the sugar levels inside the cells go down, and the cells die because they starve of fuel. You don't die because you have high blood sugar levels. You die because your cells starve from the fuel. They just can't bring it in. Now, with any effect, including cancer, the cause will immediately begin to produce an effect. Whenever the cause comes, it will immediately begin to produce an effect, but it may take a long time for that effect to become noticed. It just depends, right? For example, with cancer, you might have the cause that's in place that immediately begins to produce the effect in a particular cell, but it may take time for that to grow and continue to grow over time until it gets big enough that it can be noticed on an imaging study, or big enough so that it causes symptoms and so on. And so it may take time. It may take years between the time of the cause being in place and the effect being big enough that you might notice it. And it's true that some disease processes are faster, others are slower. Some, it's seconds, minutes, hours between the cause and the effect being noticed. Others, it can be years or decades. And when we talk about cancer, we're usually talking about years, usually. Now, it can be faster than that, but we're usually talking on the stage of years. But if we want to understand what the cause is for the condition, for the cancer, then it must meet these three criteria. One, the cause must be in place before the effect was noticed. So whenever you had your first symptoms, and I always want to know from a patient, I always want to know, when was it that you first noticed this? Right, when you first had symptoms, because I know the cause had to come before that time. It had to come before that time. And also, if the effect is present, so if you still have the cancer and it's still continuing to grow, then that means the cause is also still present, because the cancer could not continue to grow without the cause being in place also. So the cause had to be in place before the first symptom. The cause still has to be in place now, because if the cause was removed, now the effect has to go away. Now, it might be a process of time in its development, and it can be a time process in it going away, but the going away has to start right away once the cause is removed. And that's why I'm interested in causes, because who cares about risk factors? I mean, there's all sorts of risk factors for this, that, and the other thing, but it's not causative. We need to know the cause. And as was mentioned, there's one cause. And we'll highlight that a little bit later, right? So every cell functions according to the law of life. Every cell functions according to the fundamental law. And the law says that everything first takes what it needs, and then it gives away. And so the cell is dependent upon material or resources, and it's dependent upon power in order for it to function, just like an engine. It's dependent upon fuel, and it's dependent upon something to ignite that fuel. And it's the cell's own responsibility to take those resources and that power and to bring it into itself. But it doesn't do so to keep it to itself. It does it so that it can give things along, so that it can produce products, right? Produces hormones, insulin, glucagon, autocrines, paracrines, cell signaling molecules, cell adhesion molecules, all sorts of stuff, right? Now, the fuel or the raw materials that the cells need in order for them to function include things like oxygen and water and nutrients that we talked about before. In other words, the fuel for the cells is chemicals, right? The fuel is chemicals. And so the cells must have chemicals as its fuel in order for it to function. And that fuel comes from outside of the body. Everything that you need comes from outside of you and must be brought in for you to live. And there has to be a pathway for it to get in. You need oxygen, and the pathway is your respiratory tract. And so you breathe, and it goes through your respiratory tract into your lungs. But if it just stayed in your lungs, you would die, because every cell in your body needs oxygen. It needs to get to all of the cells of the body. So how are you going to get that oxygen to all of the cells? Well, it's going to be through the blood. And the blood carries the raw materials, all the fuel that every cell of the body needs. And that's why we're told in the Bible, in Leviticus 17:11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. And if we have circulatory problems where there's a lack of blood flow to a particular area, those cells cannot continue to function like they're supposed to, because they are missing the fuel, the raw materials that they need in order to function, right? And cells exist in a particular environment. And if the fluid around the cells have a sufficient amount of the chemicals that it needs, then it can extract those chemicals and it can function properly. But if it has too little, you'll end up with deficiencies. And if there's too much, then you'll end up with an excess or a toxicity. Right? Now, if you have an engine of your vehicle and that engine has a gas tank and the gas tank is full, can your engine run simply with a full gas tank? And the answer is no. Can it run with the engine and its mechanisms in the gas tank? And the answer is no. It has to have something to ignite the fuel. It's got to have a spark, right? So the cells need energy or power or a spark for them to get that fuel going and for them to function. And it also needs something to control its function along the way. And cells function as electrical units. They regulate the concentration of positively and negatively charged particles inside the cell, which results in voltage, current, and resistance, all of which are electrical properties. And the question is, where does the power come from for the cells to function? And that coordinates the cell's functions throughout the body. And the answer to that is it has to come from outside the cells that are being coordinated, and that is the nervous system. Right? Every function in the body is ultimately regulated by and coordinated through the nervous system. And what's the pathway that allows the nervous system to control and coordinate all of these other systems? Well, directly, it's the nerves. and indirectly, it's the endocrine organs. So the nervous system can stimulate the different hormone producing or chemical producing organs in the body to release certain chemicals or hormones, and those can circulate and impact the various different parts of the body, or the nervous system can directly impact a particular spot or location in the body by the particular nerve ending that goes to that location, and then control the cells in that local area, right? Now, while the nervous system is the communicating channel of that power to the different cells of the body in order to coordinate their function, we recognize again that the laws of thermodynamics tell us that all energy necessary for function comes from outside of the system. So that means that the nervous system has to get its power from outside of its own system. And the question is, where does it get that power from? And the answer is, it's not the chemicals. That's the fuel. Where does it get the spark from? And that answer is from spiritual information, right? You see, we are not just physical, we are spiritual. There's a spiritual dimension that's not well understood. And just as there is an organ or an organ system to bring in everything physical that we need, oxygen through the respiratory tract, water and food through the digestive tract, sunlight through the eyes and the skin, and so on, there's also an organ or an organ system that brings in the spiritual information, and we call that the spirit, right? Each individual has a spirit. In the beginning, Genesis 2 and verse 7, the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into whose nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being or a living soul. So the dust became the body, the breath of life became the spirit, and this living being is the soul. It's like a computer, right? It's made up of hardware and software. You have no function if you only have hardware. You have no function if you only have software. There's only function when you have the two together. Similarly, in the body, in the individual, you have no function if you just have spirit. You have no function if you just have body. It's only when the two are together. Now, as in a computer, if you bring the hardware and the software together and now you have function, well, software doesn't stop being software and hardware doesn't stop being hardware. And the software and the hardware have their individual components of the overall function. Similarly, when the spirit and the body come together, the spirit doesn't stop being spirit and the body doesn't stop being body, and each have the individual components of function, but there's no function if they're separate, only when they're together. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And in creation, which came first? Was it the physical or the spiritual? And we might be tempted to believe that it was the physical, but the question is, who is it that created? And the answer is, it's God. And what do we know about God? Well, Jesus, who had some insight on who God was, said God is spirit in John 4:24. And Jesus said in John 6:63, the words that I speak to you, they are spirit and they are life. And in John chapter 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it says that nothing was without him, nothing was made that was made, right? And in Genesis 1:6-7, it says, and God said, and it was, right? And we go through the Genesis creation story, and it says that God spoke, and it was. God spoke, and it was. So God, who is spirit, spoke what is spirit, and from that came everything that is physical. Light came from that. Planets and sun and so on came from that. Land came from that. Water came from that. Oxygen came from that. Plants and animals and so on came from that. So it's from the spiritual that everything physical comes. And you and I are created in God's image. And so in us, it's the spiritual that's first, that then impacts and controls the physical. So it is not your body that controls your mind. It is your mind that controls your body. Now, that spiritual information is brought in by your spirit and made available to your brain, the cortex of your brain, which at that point generates electrical activity, which we can measure on a EEG and a machine and so on. And that is then passed on through the different nerves to the different cells of the body, different locations of the body, where the nerve endings release chemicals. The cells themselves take those chemicals and bring them in and then change their function based upon those signals. And hence, the mind controls the different functions of the body. And it is the soul, not the brain, that thinks. And the soul is a combination of the brain and the spirit together. That's the mind. The mind is more than just the physical matter of the brain. And it's the mind that can think. It's the soul that thinks, and then controls the rest of the body. But how does the mind control the rest of the body, and under what conditions is it created to control the rest of the body? Well, in Genesis 1:26 and 27, we're told that then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. So God created us in his image to think like he thinks. And God is the author of truth. And so when truth is the foundation of the spiritual information that we think upon, that we bring into us, and then the mind can control the body through this pathway in the way to bring about proper function of the cells, the tissues, the organs, and the organ systems in the body. But if we are deceived, and instead of truth, we take lies or we take error and believe it to be the truth and bring it in, then through this same pathway, it is going to result in dysfunction in the cells, the tissues, the organs, and the organ systems of the body, because God never created the mind to control the functions of the body under the influence of error, because error is always associated with dysfunction, while truth is always associated with function. So God created us to operate under truth, which would always lead to function, not error, which then leads to dysfunction. Right? Now, we were highlighting the mind aspects now in cellular function and so on, but it's not the only thing, right? So we can have dysfunction because of inheritance, right? So with inheritance, you have DNA, which is the blueprint, the information that a cell uses in order to, that is used to make a cell, to make the different components of the cell, and that the cell uses as the blueprint to make the different products that the cell produces as well. Now, when it comes to inheritance and dysfunction associated with inheritance, then there is something that gets messed up in the blueprint itself, in the DNA, in a prior generation. So there's a defect in the DNA in a prior generation, and that defect is located in a section of the DNA called a gene. Now, what genes are sections of that code. You could say it's like a paragraph or a chapter in a book. And we'll just say a paragraph or a sentence. And, and that information is going to contain what is needed for the cell to produce a particular type of protein. And proteins make up the structure of the cells. It makes up what the cells produce, and it's involved in the function of the cells as well. So when you have an inherited condition, an inherited problem, that defective gene was passed to you when you only had one cell, when you were only one cell. And from that one cell, every other cell in your body arises. Yeah, need some water. All right. So from that one cell, all of the other cells arise. So that means that every cell in your body contains the defect, contains a defective blueprint. Of course, if you were building a house and you were using a blueprint, you wouldn't use all of the blueprint for every part of the house, right? You would use the blueprints that were for the bathroom, and the blueprints for the kitchen, and the blueprints for the roof, and so on. You wouldn't use the roof blueprints for the bathroom, and so on, right? And so it's similar in the body, only certain cells use certain genes. If that wasn't the case, all of the cells would be the same, but we do have quite a few different cells. We're over 250 different types. But it must be true that all cells of a particular type which use that defective gene will manifest that dysfunction, right? All cells of a particular type that use that defective gene will manifest the dysfunction. The defect will not be localized. It will be everywhere that particular type of cell is. For example, sickle cell anemia. An individual has a defect in a single letter of the DNA code that leads to a change in a single amino acid and a protein that's made from that. And that changes the hemoglobin molecule, that its structure is dependent upon how it wraps up and folds into a three-dimensional structure. And because it has one amino acid that's different, that has a side group that's different, it can't fold the way that it was supposed to. And so under times of stress or low oxygen or infection or other things like that, it tends to unravel. And when it does so, it causes the red blood cell to, instead of being like a donut with the middle filled, it now becomes like a sickle shaped. And now those cells can't get through the blood vessels, the little tiny capillaries, and they get stuck. And then you start blocking off blood flow, and people start having pain crises and so on with the sickle cell anemia. Well, a person that has sickle cell anemia, it affects it's in every cell. It's in every red blood cell of the body. Right? But what happens with cancer? What if an individual had cancer in the latter part of the colon, and that cancer started growing there and started growing kind of around the colon, then started growing up the colon and so on. And now by the time you find it, it's 10 centimeters long, 15 centimeters long, and so on. Is that inheritance? Well, the answer is no, it can't be. Why? Because it manifested in a particular spot within a particular type of cell or type of tissue. And that can never happen from inheritance. Inheritance must manifest itself throughout all cells of that particular type. So if colon cancer came from inheritance, it would have to be throughout the entire colon, right? If it was thyroid cancer that was because of inheritance, then it'd have to be the entire thyroid, not a spot here, a nodule there, and so on, right? So it can't be localized. Now, this dysfunction that comes from inheritance, it disrupts normal function. It does not create new function, right? It disrupts normal function, but it doesn't create new function. And again, if there's a localized problem or a localized cancer that develops in a part of the breast, one breast as opposed to the other one part of the prostate as opposed to all of the prostate, one part of the colon versus all of the colon, one part of the liver versus all of the liver, you get the idea. It can't be inheritance. All right, so another cause for dysfunction is environment. In environment, we essentially talk about trauma, right? Because the cells live within an environment that has a particular temperature, a particular pressure, and so on. And what trauma does is it damages the structure, which leads to dysfunction. Now, this is not usually associated with cancer, although we do know that when there are tissues that are repetitively traumatized over long periods of time, then that can be a location where cancer develops. Right. And so trauma can be localized. You can take a hammer and you can bang one finger and all the other fingers are okay. That one is damaged. And of course, if the damage is beyond the capacity to heal, then the effect is going to be permanent. If you cut your finger off, well, you're not going to grow a new one. If you have a good surgeon and the damage was not too extensive, you might be able to sew it back on, and it might take, and you might be able to retain that finger. But if you can't, well, you're going to be without that finger the rest of your life. The effect might be permanent. Smaller injuries that remain permanent usually reflect a dysfunction of the healing process. And that's ultimately not an environmental cause. For example, if you have somebody that has a cut somewhere, and then that cut starts growing and it starts developing scar tissue, and then it starts getting bigger and overgrowing that area and starts developing what we call a keloid, where you have that tissue that starts overgrowing and getting fatter and bigger and so on. That's not caused by trauma. That's a dysfunction of the healing process. And we've got to look for another cause from that standpoint. Trauma will only disrupt existing structure and function. It doesn't create new function, right? So it can't create a new process, for example. Now, you can have dysfunction because of chemicals. And we tend to focus on this a lot when it comes to cancer. All right, what are you eating? Have you been smoking? Have you been drinking? And so on and so forth. And so chemicals, there are certain chemicals that the body does need, like your oxygen, water, and your proper nutrients. But if you have those in too little of a quantity, you're going to have a deficiency. If you have it in too much of a quantity, you're going to have a toxicity. And then if you add something to the body that it doesn't need, like alcohol or tobacco smoke or, drugs or other things of that nature, then that's going to create dysfunction as well. But most of us have not understood how it creates the dysfunction and why we misinterpret it as a cause. For example, poisons, envenomations, toxicities, and deficiencies, what these do is they disrupt or they stop existing processes from happening and therefore lead to dysfunction. Chemicals don't create new function. They only can disrupt a function, or they can be used as a part of an existing process in order for it to go forward, right? They never create a new process. For example, here you have, let's say, left-sided male breast cancer. Yes, men get breast cancer too. It's just 1,000 times less than women, so it's not as often. So here you have breast cancer, one of the most common forms of cancer that we would see at the Lifestyle Center. And we know that there are certain things that contribute to breast cancer, including high-fat diets, consumption of animal products, especially processed meats and red meats, hormone exposure, and so on and so forth. And one of the ways of decreasing your risk of developing breast cancer, as we're told, is to change your diet, stop eating the animals and the animal byproducts, start eating a whole plant food diet, and so on. But the question that I have for us is diet the cause of breast cancer? Is it the cause of the breast cancer? And therefore, is it the solution? Well, let's remember our chemistry class that we had when we were growing up. And chemistry class had a demonstration, and that demonstration was of diffusion. Here you have the picture of somebody dropping drops of dye into a clear water beaker, and now it's spreading throughout that beaker. And you may have seen that in the class where the professor drops or the teacher drops the dye in the various different things, and it eventually moves out throughout all of that space and becomes into an even concentration throughout that fluid environment. That's the nature of diffusion. It goes from your chemical goes from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration and tends to even itself out throughout the entire fluid environment that it's in. Now, because that's the case, if you put drops in here in this situation and diffusion is working, especially when you consider the cardiovascular system where there's a heart that's pumping, there's blood vessels that are the tubes where the blood is flowing through, it's flowing and so on. And so you always have this mixing that's going on in the cardiovascular system. So when you eat that hamburger, when you drink that milkshake, when you have that food, when you smoke that cigarette and all that kind of stuff, and those substances get into the bloodstream and they go circulating all over the place. Well, where do they go? Well, the answer is everywhere. Right, they go everywhere, and so you have an individual who might have been eating an unhealthy diet, and here they develop breast cancer in the left breast. But my question is, how much of the bad food that they were eating went to the right breast? Well, the answer is the same amount. So why do you have a cancer that's developing on the left breast and you don't have a cancer that's developing in the right breast? Why is it in one spot in the left breast and it's not throughout the entire left breast? And why doesn't it include all of both breasts in the same tissue? If it was the chemical itself, now chemicals may cause dysfunction in a certain type of cell first, but it should be relatively even across that type of cell, just like inheritance, right? Just like inheritance. If you see this on the beach, what is your conclusion? Mind you, those who are listening, it's a sandcastle, right? So if you go to the beach and you see a sandcastle, what do you conclude? Nobody concludes that the sand made the sandcastle. No one, right? Not even an atheist. No one concludes that the sand made a sandcastle. That is not a random process. Everybody understands that somebody used the sand to make the sandcastle. Now, if you didn't have the sand, could you make the sandcastle? The answer is no. So if you take the sand away, you can take away the sandcastle, but does that mean that you've taken care of the sandcastle builder? The answer is no. Right? So you might have had, eating a diet high in animal protein. So you might have been eating a diet high in fat. You might have been eating all that kind of stuff, and it's been circulating throughout your entire body. And now you develop a left-sided breast cancer, and you blame it on the chemicals that you were eating. Well, no, it can't be the chemical that causes its own concentration in that area and then begins the problem. Now, is the chemical a part of the problem? The answer is yes, it is. It's a part of the problem, but it's not the cause of the problem. There has to be something at that point in that spot that leads to that being the location where the cancer develops. And a chemical cannot create a new process. Remember, chemicals can only be used as a part of a process that's already there. It's not a chemical that can create a process. It's something that is living that can create a process. So when you remove the chemical or the cofactor, then the disease process doesn't manifest itself. Like if you got the sandcastle and you washed it away, well, then there's no manifestation of the sandcastle anymore. But the chemical is not the cause, because the chemical can't create a process. It's only used as a part of the process. And it must be even across a particular cell type. So if you have thyroid dysfunction because of iodine deficiency, you should see that across the thyroid and not just in a nodule here, there, or the other place. If it's a specific location within a particular type of tissue, it's not inheritance, it's not chemicals that are the cause. Well, what are we left with? Well, we're left with also the mind. And how can the mind be involved in this? Well, everything in the body is regulated very carefully by the mind. You have those wires, those nerves that start up in the cortex of the brain, and then they go down to a specific spot in the midbrain, and then they synapse with another neuron, that is specific neuron that it synapses with, and that carries the information down the spinal cord, and then that goes to another one that goes to a specific spot in the body, and it goes to a particular location. And that particular location receives the information from that part of the cortex, and there's another part of the cortex that receives the information from that location. So that if you had your eyes closed and somebody was pinning the tail on the donkey and you were the donkey and they pinned you, you would know exactly where they pinned you, because the nervous system is set up in that very specific way. Everybody controls their toes on the inside, the upper inner portion of the cortex of their brain. And everybody controls their tongues on the outer lateral aspect of their brain, and so on. So it's very regulated, very specific, where that information or that signal being sent from the cortex ends up in the body. So you can have very localized dysfunction that happens in particular locations in the body because of the mind and how the mind is set up and how it regulates things in their function, right? So what do you find at the center of a tumor? You find a nerve, right? And interestingly enough, if you cut the nerve that's going to the center of a tumor, it changes how the tumor behaves. In fact, there's quite a bit of research and that has come out to show that every step in the cancer process, all the way from cancer initiation, for the initial genetic changes that start happening in a cell and its initial changes so that it can, every cell has kind of a basement membrane that it gets stuck to. And every cell it has this thing that we call anoikis. If it gets attached to its basement membrane, it can live and grow and replicate. And if it gets away from that basement membrane, it should die. Well, the nervous system and the chemicals that are released from the nerves can prevent that dying process from happening and allow the cell to live as it gets away from its basement membrane. The nervous system can produce chemicals that allows the cell to start changing its shape and its form so that instead of being stuck, it can then be somewhat mobile. The nervous system influences the growth of blood vessels to that area. And the nervous system has been shown to help the cancer to hide from the immune system and and so on, and to helping it to be able to get to grow in its local environment, to be able to get into the lymphatic system and the blood circulatory system, and then to be able to implant in another location. The nervous system, through its production of chemicals through the nerves, are involved in every step of the process. Every step of the process, right? It is the mind that controls processes in the body. And it's the mind that can start a process, stop a process, increase it, decrease it. It's the mind that regulates all of the homeostatic mechanisms like your heart rate, your blood pressure, your fluid volume, your electrolyte levels, pH balance, and all that kind of stuff. And its effects can be generalized, like in your fight or flight response and the release of adrenaline and so on. Your whole body gets affected by that. Or it can be very localized. This spot, left breast, right there, where that tumor began. And it's the mind that controls the immune system and the immune system's function. And immune system is always involved in inflammation. And so it's the control. Ultimately, the mind is the controller of inflammation and the inflammatory response in the body. And it is the primary, but not the only controller of cell, tissue, organ, and organ system function. And 90% of the time, if you want to find the cause of the cancer, go looking for the mind, right? Go looking in the mind for the cause. I can't tell you how many times that I have had a patient whom I'm taking care of that has cancer, and there is some significant loss or trauma or some kind of psychological stressor that has happened in their life before they develop their cancer, right? Before they develop their cancer. All right. Now, we recognize that by the law of cause and effect, that every effect has a cause, and every cause produces an effect. And we recognize from thermodynamics that all energy necessary for a system to function must come from outside of that system. So that means that the cause can never be found where the effect is. The cause can never be found where the effect is, because the power, the material, the resources that were needed for the cause to begin had to come from outside of it. So you will never find the cause of the cancer by looking at the cancer. That's the one place that you can guarantee you will never find the cause, because the cause had to come outside of there. So a biopsy will never tell you why you have the cancer. It can't. It can only tell you what kind of cancer you have and so on, but it'll never tell you why, because the answer to why is outside of there. And we also have an enemy, right? As we see in the case of Job and so on, where in the case of Job, he had boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Did it contain bacteria? I'm sure it did. Was it the bacteria that was the cause? No. And you could probably treat Job with all the antibiotics that you've got available to you, and his condition wouldn't resolve. Why? It wasn't the cause. It was the enemy and the enemy's sin that was the cause of Job's condition. And God allowed it for a particular reason, and that condition was going to remain until the reason was accomplished. And once that reason was accomplished and God said, okay, that's it, then the healing process took over at that point and Job got better. So when it comes to dysfunction in the body, it's either inheritance, which if so, it must be even across all cells of a particular type. It can be environment, which is trauma, burning, freezing, smashing, cutting, things of that nature, which can be localized, but you usually remember when something like that happened. It can be chemicals, but again, chemicals must affect all cells of a particular type fairly evenly, and chemicals cannot concentrate themselves. They can be concentrated, they can be used in a process, but they can't create the process themselves. There's the enemy who can have access and do things for sure. And that can be the case, and that needs to be considered and so on. But ultimately, and in the vast majority of cases, you have the mind, right? That is the cause. Now, what is the underlying issue of the mind that leads it to this place? And I'm just going to talk now because I don't have the slides for it at the moment because my computer died. But, all right, what is the foundational issue of the mind? What was mentioned at the beginning, what is the one root cause, right? You take a tree, and a tree has thousands and thousands of leaves. It's got hundreds and hundreds of branches, right? Twigs, I should say. It's got tens of branches. It's got one trunk. There are thousands and thousands of symptoms, and there's thousands of manifestations and so on. There are hundreds of diseases, which are simply what branch has these leaves on it, right? These different types of symptoms. We have these types of symptoms together, then it belongs on this branch and we call it this disease. Right? But if you bring it all down, it has one cause, has one root, right? And the cause is sin. Again, not only the individual's sin, it can be the enemy's sin. It can be sin that impacts the environment and other things of that nature. But the vast majority of the time, it's the individual's own issues of the mind that are leading to the dysfunction of the body. And I see that happening very prominently in cancer, which is why some of the questions that I have had as taking care of health ministries, directors for churches and so on that have cancer, and they're asking me, I haven't smoked, I haven't drank, I've lived by the health message, I am exercising, I'm eating a whole food plant-based diet, I'm advocating health in the church and all this kind of stuff, and I have cancer. How come I'm getting cancer? This cannot be happening to me. And this is how is this going to impact the health message and all that kind of stuff? If I'm a health reformer and now I'm coming down with cancer and they're eating meat and they're doing this and that and they're healthy. Well, my question is, are you a happy health reformer or are you a miserable health reformer? Are you frustrated at all of those that you're ministering to that don't respond and don't care about what you're saying and continue eating their meat and drinking their this and that and the other things of that kind of, and if you had the capacity to do so, if you had the power and whatever to do so, would you control them so that they would be good? Would you make them be good? That's evil. That's evil. Evil is forcing someone to do good. It's forcing someone to do good. What I think is good. The foundation of our problem is sinful, fallen human nature, right? Human nature that is sinful and fallen that we have inherited from Adam and Eve has a foundational problem. And that foundational problem is we believe that we're God. We believe we're God. And so what do you mean? Well, that was the original lie that was given to Eve at the tree. And in fact, it was the self-deception of Satan in heaven. It was this idea that the creature could somehow become God and could somehow be God. Sin can only come in the context of that deception, because now, as I am God, now I can choose differently than God chooses, because I see something better than he does. He doesn't have my best interests in mind. I have my best interests in mind. So I'm going to pursue what is my best interest, regardless of what he says. And now I go opposite of him. You and I are created to always go after gain. That's how we're created, to always go after gain. But what happens in the deception of sinful nature is that we become deceived into thinking that gain, which was over there, is over here. And that loss, which was over here, is now over here. And so our compass is turned around backwards so that instead of the needle pointing north, it points south, but we still think it's pointing north. And so we orient ourselves after that compass, and we pursue that compass, and we still go after what we believe is gain, but we actually are accomplishing loss in the process. And as God, if I think that I'm God, then I am my own. And if I am my own, then what is done to me. It's personal. And if it's done to me and it's personal, then it's my problem. And if it's my problem and I'm God, then I've got to fix it somehow. I've got to make it come out and be successful. But if I'm God, it can't be, the problem can't originate from me. It's got to originate from someone else outside of me. So I see all of the problems coming from outside of me, and I've got to fix all the problems outside of me so that I can be free of problems. And so I try to control time. I try to control circumstances. I try to control people. I try to control resources. I try to control finances. I try to control reputation. I try to control all of these different things, which are outside of me, and I see it as the problem. But I can't control anything outside of me. And so I fail at controlling it all. And the result of trying to control what you cannot control is stress. The result of trying to control what you cannot control is stress. And stress becomes the result of that. And then we live in that stress. We live in personal hurts because we think what they said and what they did was against us. We take it personally. Now it's a personal insult. It's a personal assault. It's, and so on. And if I'm God, then I'm the owner. I'm not the steward. And so whatever it is or whoever it is, they belong to me. And so if it is burned, if it is destroyed, if they die, if they walk away from me, it's my loss. It's my loss. It's my personal loss. And if I'm God, then I must be worshiped. Others must love me. Others must respect me. Others must honor me. Others must understand me. Others must trust me well. And when they don't behave well towards me, I can't tolerate that. And I either have to cut myself off from them and separate from myself from them because I see them as a danger to me, or I have to try to fix them so that they behave better, so that they can honor me and respect me, and so on and so forth. And if I am God, but I'm not, I'm actually a creature and I'm dependent, then I cut myself off from him, but I attach myself to others and I make them my source, and now I depend upon them. I need them for acceptance. I need them for belonging. I need them for harmony. I need them for security. I need them for love, and so on and so forth. But the best way that I can get that from them is to try to give from myself first so that I can get those things from them in return. And so my love is a love of giving in order to receive. For example, when we tell another individual, I love you, are we telling them that as a statement of fact, or are we telling them that as a request? Let you sink, let that one sink a little bit, right? When you say I love you to somebody, is that a statement of fact or is that a request? Well, you might say, okay, well, it's a statement of fact. Okay. Well, if you tell them I love you and they say, okay, and the next time you tell them I love you, they say, whatever. And the next time you tell them I love you, they say, well, that's your problem. And the next time they tell them I love you, they say, well, you got a problem in your head, get it checked. And the next time you tell them I love you, they say, well, that's, I don't love you. That's your problem. Every time you said I love you and you got the response like that, how long would you continue saying I love you? Well, the answer is not very long. Why? Because I love you is not a statement of fact. I love you is a request. It's a request for I love you too. And as long as the fishing rod has the right bait on it, and I get what I want back from it, I will continue to be generous and loving and so on and so forth, as long as I get back what I expect. As long as my husband or my wife respects me and honors me and listens to me and so on and so forth, then I'm okay. But the moment they stop doing that, I'm a mess. And I can't help it. Why? Because I have them as my source. Why? Because I am God, but I have cut myself off from God. I'm still actually dependent, so I latch on to them. And now I'm dependent upon them, and I need others for me. My love is no longer unselfish. It is selfish. But we're born that way, so we're born in this selfish state. And if I'm God, then I'm the judge. And I judge by my own criteria. And others don't meet up to my criteria, so I have resentment and bitterness towards them, and I don't meet up to my own criteria, and so I have guilt and I have self-hatred and other things of that nature, and I beat myself up and I have a low value and all of that kind of stuff. And all of this is the result of the foundational issue of a false identity. I am God. I am God. And all of these are the tentacles of I am God in our lives. And it is the chaos that we live under, the ways that we respond, the worldview that we have of things that happen around us. And God never created us for that worldview. He never created us to be God. He created us to be a creature, a child of God. And when that deception is how we live, and how we think and the direction that we head in, then the mind cannot control the body the way that it's supposed to. And dysfunction will result, including cancer. Cancer is never the result of a traumatic event that happened. Never. Cancer is the result of how I think relative to whatever that trauma was. And because the trauma will come and go and it's gone. The trauma might have been 5 years ago. It might have been a divorce that you went through and so on. The divorce is done. It's gone. They've moved on. They've remarried, and all that kind of stuff. But your thinking and your thought process continues in relation to that. And it's that thinking and that process, that thought process, that is the major issue that's leading to the development of the cancer. Yes, you can change your diet. Yes, you can exercise. Yes, you can juice. Yes, you can do all of these different things. And if you want, we've got a protocol on our website, npmen.org. We got a cancer protocol there. You can go to the articles and look up the health stuff, and you can find the cancer protocol. That's fine. You can do all those things, and it's not wrong to do those things. But if you do those things and you don't get to the cause and remove the cause, it's not going to help you in the long run. It's not going to help you in the long run. When we separate health and sin from each other, then what we also do is, when we separate disease and sin from each other, then what we also do is we separate health and the gospel from each other. And it simply becomes a physical thing, a physical manifestation with a physical cause. And therefore, we must look for physical solutions. No, my friends, that's not the case. That's not it at all. It's a spiritual problem with a physical manifestation. And the solution is a spiritual solution. That's why Ministry of Healing, I believe it's page 115, paragraph 2. You can check it, make sure I'm right or not. It says that the gospel, when received in its purity and power, is a cure for the maladies that originated in sin. Well, is cancer a malady that originated in sin? Yeah. What about hypertension? Yeah. Other cardiovascular disease? Yeah. Diabetes? Yeah. Alzheimer's? Yeah. 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 You name it. Addictions? Yeah. All of that stuff. So all maladies that originated in sin. The gospel, when received in its purity and power, is a cure for the maladies that originated in sin. Why? Because the underlying problem is a spiritual problem. That was Ministry of Healing, page 115, paragraph 2. So, why does an individual have the diet they have? There's always a reason. Why does an individual exercise or not exercise the way that they do or they don't? There's always a reason. Why does an individual take this thing, take that thing, not take that thing, use that thing, and so on? There's always a reason behind it. And the reason is found in the mind of the individual. The physical things are only a manifestation of what is going on spiritually in the individual. Does lifestyle have an impact to play? Yes, it does, but not as a root cause. Only as an intermediate cause. Right? It's a domino along the pathway. It's not the first domino. What's the solution for this? Next week, right? We need to get to that next week and look at the solution to it. But we do need to understand where things come from. And if we don't understand that, we're going to go looking in the wrong place for the wrong solutions, and we're still going to end up frustrated because it's just not working. Just not working.